Hello, Tom Taylor with my wife Allison Taylor, Pictures and Stories. And today we'd like to talk about your life story assets, gathering photos and documents. This is a very important part of putting your life stories together and making them interesting and appealing to those that you'll share them with. Even thousands of years ago, brilliant individuals understood the value of images and really how our minds think. Aristotle said, the soul never thinks without an image. And that's how we are. Our minds process thoughts in images, and that's how we communicate with each other, is through images. People who really understood that, one of which was Walt Disney, said, of all our inventions for mass communication, pictures still speak the most universally understood language. And he really knew what he was talking about. Many of you may remember the great TV show that would come on Sunday night, The Wonderful World of Disney, and how fun that was, and how many great films that have come out of Disney and theme parks and such. He understands the value of pictures in communication and how important that is to our language and culture. So when we consider who we're going to be sharing these books and our stories with, we need to think about our audience. They've been brought up with media, with pictures, sophisticated, high level of communication. Not that we need to have all that level of sophistication, but we need to know the environment that they're in and how important pictures are. So consider your audience in that your pictures are going to be a valuable part in communicating with them. Several years ago, I was a teenager and I was into photography. And I bought a camera and I got an enlarger and I had a darkroom set up. And I found some old negatives in some of my parents' boxes, and there were some large format negatives. I think they were 2¼ inch negatives, and so I processed some and I printed some large prints, and I think I even printed one was a 11 by 14 inch print, and I was quite excited with this really great looking old image, and I took it and showed it to my mother, and she said, well, that is my mother. And I found out that this particular image of my grandmother and her 2 younger sisters, that this was taken at their mother's funeral. Their mother, my great-grandmother, had just sewn these beautiful dresses for her daughters and passed away. And they were wearing these dresses that she had just made at her funeral, where this picture was taken. That's my grandmother on the left, her younger sisters, Alice and Edith. And this is really the beginning of how I got to know my grandmother. So there can be an emotional impact in pictures, and that's what there should be, is you should find those with an emotional impact. And this is what can make your stories more visually compelling. They help tell the story. It's been said that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that really can be the case. So consider your audience and find pictures that can really communicate with them the things that you want to tell them, the stories, and tell them about those pictures and have those pictures help communicate the stories that you want to share with them. So when you think of a book, which book would you rather read? Here's a book that has a great narrative. It's exciting, it's interesting, but you really have to be able to get into those words on the page to get that. And it's not maybe as immediately interesting as maybe this book. So which book would you rather read? This is the book with going on an outing is where this particular situation they're talking about. Family gatherings. There they are, loaded up in Grandpa's truck, driving up to the lake where they can have a picnic. And here's a picture of the family by the lake having a picnic with a little caption there, the family at the family picnic where Mary stepped on my birthday cake. So just notice how visually important the pictures are in drawing you into the story. Our eyes and interests go first to the pictures. So when you look at these pages, this open spread of this book, where do our eyes go? They go to that picture of the family around the van as they traveled through Europe and it takes them and say, oh, what's happening there? And he'll draw us back into the story. Of course, headings and captions are also a means of doing that, but a good picture can help draw the reader into the story and want to know what's happening there. We were able to help a woman tell a story of her life, and the title of her book was I May Be Old Someday. And she wrote this book when she was 104 and talked about emigrating to America. And when we asked her what pictures she had to go along with her story, she said, oh, I really don't have much. And when we got looking, she had travel documents, her passport, and some of these things that were really valuable images in her record. And they became a great part of her book as we included them with the photos that we had. And so think about the other things besides just your photos that may be important in telling your stories. Last week, we talked about building a timeline and brainstorming and getting a lot of ideas that you can use in your life stories, and how important it would be to use pictures to give you ideas. And they're a wonderful memory trigger to get ideas down. And so now as you begin to go through your pictures and documents, you can use those ideas that you'll put back in your timeline and your brainstorm list in order for you to find those particular stories that you'll want to share. And so pictures can help bring memories and ideas that you'll want to share in your life stories. So if you died tomorrow, what would your posterity be left with? Would it be boxes unorganized in the attic, or pictures in drawers or closets or boxes put away? How easy would it be for our children or posterity to get at these elements and make use of them? There's likely treasure in those boxes. It's just very difficult to understand that's the case when you just look at that. And we've seen so many times where these things can just, for lack of understanding of what they are, be thrown out, discarded, because of having to deal with these unorganized masses of material that you just don't know what to do with, and so they get thrown away. And what a tragedy that can be. So we think of how we want to organize these things for our posterity so that they can be of value to future generations. So we talk about our personal history assets and about gathering those personal history assets and what they are. And those are things like our photos and slides. And when I say assets, it's they're things of value. They're things that are important. There's things that you need to decide what to do with and how to share them. We spend maybe time considering what we'll do with our financial assets and how those may be passed on through a will or other documents. But it's important to consider our personal history assets. As I said, those things like photos, slides, letters, and documents can be a very important thing, as we showed those earlier travel documents. Certificates, newspaper clippings, how you could have scrapbooks and albums where there's been some organization done. Film and video, some wonderful elements can be gathered from old films and even video recordings that have been made, and these are part of your personal history assets. Several years ago, when I began in this as a business, I remember getting this big box of 8mm films that my grandfather had shot. There were just many, many rolls. I think there were over 100 rolls of film. And I remember taking the time to get all of those converted into a digital environment so that I could enjoy them and make use of them. And in all of that film, there was really, most of it was either out of focus or zooming in and out and panning from one direction to the other very quickly, and the video was very difficult to watch. But there were some moments of pure gold, of seeing my grandfather on his horses, riding and doing the things that he loved so much. And so even going through all that material, I found some wonderful treasures. And you can find those things as well as you look. Could be old audio recordings, whether that be on tape, reel-to-reel cassettes, whatever nature of audio recordings you could have. There could be treasure in there, and that's part of your personal history assets, and you want to understand what you've got what's there. Journals and diaries certainly are important, and the genealogies that you have are a part of your personal history assets that you want to understand what you've got. Memorabilia, it could be jewelry or pieces of furniture in your home or your grandmother's china. Many things, memorabilia could be important. Family treasures and things that tell a story that you may want to make note of that could be shared with the future and for people to understand what they are. Maybe a list of others that you should talk with in order to understand your personal history assets that can shed some light on your stories and family stories and the things that ought to be shared in the future. And the key here is to take those personal history assets and just get an understanding of what you've got. This is really in your workbook, in your guidebook. We've left a couple pages where you can write down notes about what your personal history assets are to begin to take an inventory. You don't have to identify every single piece, but begin to get a broad scope, an overview of the things you've got. That you have photos when you were in high school. It could be yearbooks. It could be other things that are a part of your assets that you'll just want to make a note of what you've got and where they are, so that when you're taking this look at your life, you can know the things you have available to help tell your stories. And so the thing we encourage is for you to go through those closets, those drawers, attics, scrapbooks, and just make an inventory of what you've got so that you can begin to use that in putting your life stories together. So look at all those things. You can gather it together, or you can walk around and just make sure you have a good inventory. In a business, you want to take an inventory of the stock that you have for trade or sell, and know what you have so that you can deal with it properly. And that's the same thing you want to do with your personal history assets, is to understand what you've got, because then you'll know how to use it, and then you'll know how to select those things that will be appropriate for the particular story that you're going to tell.
There's a correlation between your pictures and stories that there's kind of a workflow that you can use that will help each other, where the stories will support the pictures and the pictures will support the stories. And even though we advocate that you don't try to add your stories into, add your pictures into a Word document at the time that you're writing your stories, that you keep the pictures and the stories separate. We'll talk about that later. But when you're gathering ideas for stories, when you begin to write your stories, and if you also are gathering your pictures at the same time, this can be a very effective way to kind of go back and forth between your stories and your pictures. It's helpful for brainstorming story ideas, and also for figuring out what photos are going to be the most valuable for you to use in your project, whether it's a book project or whether you're getting ready to upload a bunch of pictures and such up onto a website such as Family Search or Ancestry.com or some other website where you would want to make your photos available to other people. So essentially on this slide here, we've got on the left rung of the ladder, you can see it says gathering and writing stories. And on the right rung of the ladder, it says gathering and choosing pictures. So you're going to do these things simultaneously, but there's also a lot of crossover in between the two rungs. So essentially, here's how it works. As you're working on your timeline, which we talked about in the last couple of weeks, and you're gathering story ideas, you're brainstorming memories, you're triggering all these memories and writing them down on a timeline or on some other notebook or some way to capture these story ideas. So while you're doing that, if you're also starting to gather your pictures and your other life story assets, the two will work together quite well. So here's how it goes. I've got a picture here of a woman with her cute little dog. So you may be thinking about a story of something that happened in your childhood, and you remember, oh yeah, I had this dog named Butch, and he was, maybe he saved my life or something. And so you jot down something on your timeline about that story. And then suddenly you you then find, as you're going through your photos, you find a picture of yourself with the dog that you didn't remember that you had. And that might remind you of some other memories and remind you of another story of something that happened with that dog, which you can then write on your timeline. So you're going to add that to your timeline, and then you just keep sort of going through this process. So seeing your pictures as you go through them will remind you of stories to write on your timeline. And when you are writing your story ideas on the timeline, that will remind you of, hey, I think I had a picture of that. Let me go see if I can find it. So it's sort of a good way to just keep going back and forth between your pictures and stories while you're in this initial gathering process.
So really, which pictures to use? It's really completely up to you. But the thing I would say when you decide which pictures you want to use is think of really your purpose, your audience, and your scope. So you have stories, you have your pictures, and then your purpose and your audience. Where do they overlap? Where do those all merge and intersect? That's what we call the sweet spot, where you have a story that you have pictures that go along with that, that's right in line with what you want to say, why you're telling this, who you want to tell it to, that fits in the scope of what you're looking at. That's where you have the sweet spot. Now, not everything that you do in your life stories is going to be right in that sweet spot, but when it is, there's real power there. There is real value in something where you have a story, you have some kind of a picture image to go with that, and of course you want to have that in line with why you're doing this and who you're doing it for. And within the scope. We talked about the scope in that you want to narrow this down and focus on what you're doing with this particular project. Now, we'd like to just share a few ideas as we've talked about what some of these assets are and how they're meaningful. So as you consider the purpose, the audience, and scope, I would say of this project, because we've talked about scope and how, we're encouraging people to not get bogged down with trying to tell the whole story of their life, at least all at once. And so as you select and say, well, maybe I'll begin with this portion, we'll do somewhat the same with your personal history assets. This can be an overwhelming part as well when you consider all of these assets. We may have thousands of photos and numerous albums and thousands of slides and all sorts of documents and things that could be used, but then it's a matter of really deciding, okay, what am I really trying to do right now? And we'll talk about later as we go on ways to organize and make use of all these type of assets to get them in perfect order. But the thing is to know and understand what you've got and select the things that are for this particular project and set aside for a time the things that you may use later, even though you want to list and inventory those and understand what they are, but it's a matter of selecting things that are important for this particular project. So, just want to show a few things that may spark some elements in your own lives. And that's what we see the value of these webinars are, is it's not just taking the things that we say, but it's like, what does this mean to you? What do these things mean to your audience, those that you'll be sharing your stories with? So as these ideas come up, think, well, not only that this is what that person's doing or Tom or Allison are doing, but what maybe sparks a memory that you could be sharing in your own life, and make a note of that. So here's just a page of a book of some of our really good friends, and the people that we work with become our good friends. In fact, they often say we know and understand them better than their own children. But this page shows the first postcard that these two, this couple who then married and raised a wonderful family, shared. And they saved this postcard. Well, think in your own lives, what are some of these elements that are a part of your life and your stories? And then there's a letter that goes along with that. Now that goes back to a specific memory and a wonderful time of their life. It shows their handwriting. It brings emotion. Man, that's dated September 15th, 1954. A postcard stamp was 2 cents. Look at all the things that are communicated in this. Lots of elements in this story that are wonderful, that can be shared. And so you want to reach in and find out what things that you have. Just another letter. He talked about driving off to California to work and how his car broke down. So he had a little drawing of that. He doesn't consider himself an artist, but look what what a nice thing this is to have as a part of his history, this letter that he sent some, 50 years ago, or more than that, I guess, even now, 60 years ago. Wonderful elements. What are those elements that are in your life that would be your personal history assets? We have things, I mentioned, memorabilia. We're talking with a good family in Heber, and they talked about, one of the stories was thriftiness is next to godliness, and how their father would even take furniture and wire it back together. And they said, in fact, we even have that chair downstairs. We said, well, we had to get a picture of that chair and put it in the book because that's important. So this was just a piece of memorabilia of this chair that was wired together by their father. You may have furniture or other things in your lives or your homes that could be elements to demonstrate those themes and important principles in your lives. They talked about a telephone and about a storm, and this is the old phone, and one of the daughters had this in her home, so a picture of that got into their book. I interviewed one woman who she told about her husband and how he'd retired and how retirement was hard on him, but he went into carving wooden ducks and painting them. They were beautiful. And so pictures of those carved wooden ducks became an important part of her book, sharing the stories of her husband, who he was. It may just be letters that go along with handwritten letters. These are some notes that my sister had written to me back in 1974. So when we were telling her story, this showed the things that she was engaged with and what she was thinking and doing, and it shows her handwriting and her picture. And what a wonderful thing to share some of these stories. Nice to maybe have some of that typed out in the narrative of your story, but also the actual handwritten documents can be important in your book and sharing these stories. There may be numerous types of documents. You think of graduating from college. There may be report cards, other kinds of documents, maybe a picture, maybe even a diploma. Those could be put as a collage on a page or even captioned. It just really depends on what is the best way to tell your story. Many of us have, like we mentioned, report cards. Now, looking back, you'll say, gosh, am I really proud? There was a lot of A's there, but there was even a D. Wow. But after you look back 40, 50, 60 years, is that big of a problem? I don't think so. People that accomplish so much, and you show your struggles and you show your accomplishments, and maybe there's a story about that particular class. But some of these things can really bring life to that point in time and help tell your stories. We look here at telling stories, whether that be about sports or anything. Allison, you have a bit to share about this story of sports in Blaine's life.
Well, this is a book that we did for a client, and he was telling a story about how he got involved in sports. And his favorite magazine was called The Open Road for Boys, and it would always have articles about sports. And that magazine, he always looked forward to it coming, and that inspired him to get involved in sports. And we managed to track down a magazine that actually had a cover of some people playing football that was the actual magazine that he looked at the time. So we were able to scan that and include that in his book. So you can, if you are lacking pictures of a particular time period, if you're lacking pictures of yourself or your family during that time period, you can often find other images that you can use to give historical background. You just have to be aware that you're not violating anyone else's copyright by doing so. But if you choose to use that can be a really nice addition to your book.
I think one thing we all can think back is some of the homes that we grew up in, or maybe some of the places that we lived. And so you could even draw a diagram of the floor plan of that home. That could be an important element in your book, but it also is just this wonderful method of drawing the memories out of you, and it's a trigger to so many things, that stories that could come. And so I encourage you to do that. Draw a floor plan of a home you grew up in, and it will remind you of so many things, and could be used even in your book. Plaques, documents, letters, some of these things that are important, a nice way to share them is just in pages of your book, whether they're full size or scaled down, so that you can show those along with the story and time of your life as you're sharing those things. Whether you're old or young, certificate of blessing, birth. The American National Red Cross. Here's this document that was dated 1942. I think he was in junior high. Boy Scouts, first aid. I mean, it could be all sorts of things, whatever they may be. Some of these things can be just wonderful elements in a book. I loved looking at one of the elements from my parents, early family. It was delivery of Jimmy, my older brother, and I think it was the total hospital and doctor bill was something like $17.50. And it tells about that story of the family, but shares back about, wow, that's what healthcare was like back in 1950. So reach back and find some of these things that help tell your stories.
I'm just going to take a few minutes today and talk about some ways to begin organizing your photos as you're gathering them. And generally, my suggestion would be, if you are in the process of working on a life story book or a family history or something at the time, that you focus on those pictures that you're going to use for this project and set the rest of them aside that you can organize another time. Because if you start off by saying, well, I'm going to get this book done after I organize all of my photos that I have, it could take you a while. So you don't want to overwhelm yourself that way. So that would be my suggestion, but this is also a really good method to organize all of your photos if that's what you decide that you want to do. But I would suggest that if you're working on a project, that you go ahead and just focus on the photos that you're going to use for this particular project right now, and then you can always use the same method to go and organize the rest of them. I'm just going to briefly go through some of these concepts today, and then we will be having another webinar that will detail this whole method of organizing your photos, both your digital photos and your physical assets, in more depth at a later time. In fact, I gave an hour-long presentation at Roots Tech a couple of weeks ago about this particular subject of organizing, particularly digital photos. And we hope to be able to get a copy of that, which we can then put up on the membership website so that you can view that. But we will be also covering this in more detail in the future. Your first step is to just start loosely gathering some things that you want to use for this particular project. Let's say that you are doing a book just about your childhood, and that's what you've decided your scope is for this project at the time. So you may come across some great photographs from later on in your life, but they might not be appropriate for this particular project, so you can put those aside and get to those later. I just recently, a few weeks ago, took a weekend and made a small book for my daughter. It was about 30 pages, and it just told some funny stories of things that happened to me during my elementary school years. A very short, limited scope book, and I had just gotten a box of photographs from my dad that I hadn't really seen a lot of the photos before, and I hadn't had a chance to scan those before. So that gave me a chance to look at those and to go through them and decide, what's going to work well for this particular book. And there were some from my teenage years which I put aside and said, I'm going to deal with these later. So the first thing to do is, after you've sort of gathered a pile of things that you might want to use for this project, is to begin loosely sorting them into categories. And generally, I think it's easiest to use the categories that you have divided your life into on your timeline. You don't necessarily have to, but I think that's a helpful way that you're sort of, keeping in the same general organizational area. So if you have your timeline broken down into decades, you can also, maybe make piles of pictures in decades. I've shown on the screen here a little just a simple file folder that just has tabs per decade, and you can just slip them into the file folders. And this would be, before you get around to digitizing anything, to get your physical pictures loosely organized and categorized. Okay, I've sort of come up with an acronym that's a system or a method of organizing both your digital photos, and this also works with your physical photos once you have organized them and scanned them. And basically the acronym is CALM, and it stands for create folders, and then you're going to assign the photos to a folder, label the photos, and then make backups. And that's how I sort of remember what to do in what order as I go along. So the first part of this is creating folders in which to put your digital photos. And as I said, I'm going to kind of go through this really quickly, but we will devote a whole webinar to this later on to go through it in more detail. But essentially you're creating folders. They're kind of like the, if I'll go back a couple of slides, but the folders are kind of like file folders in a file drawer, only they're on your computer. And those essentially give you a place to put things that I've also likened it to a sock drawer. You know, you have a sock drawer for your socks and you have an underwear drawer for your underwear, and you want to make sure that things are generally in their right drawer. You don't have to have them all alphabetized and color coordinated, but at least if they're in a folder that is recognizable to you, then you will quickly know where to find that photo. It's much better than having all of your clothes piled up on the floor of the laundry room, which is what most of our computers look like a lot of the time, when we just have sort of everything from our lives shoved into a My Documents folder, or we're sitting on your desktop. So you want to create folders that either maybe by year, by decade, by location, whatever system works for you. Create those folders and then put the photos in their appropriate folders. You're putting the socks in the sock drawer. Okay, so here's an example of just a simple, really simple folder hierarchy on my computer for a life story project. At the top you can see my master folder is called Photos for Life Story Project, and then I have things divided into decades, and then within a decade I might have them divided out into different parts of that decade or different life events, kind of based on the loose categories that you have on your timeline. And then you're going to go to a folder that just has a bunch of random photos in it, and you're just going to drag those folders or those photographs from the folder where they're into the proper folder, and pretty soon you'll have a whole system of photos there, and you will easily know where to find things. So when you're ready to start putting together your project, you can find those really easily. Then after you go through your physical photos and you scan those, which we will also be having another webinar talking about proper scanning techniques in the future. But after they've been scanned, you're going to take those scans and add them into the same system so that all of your photos are organized according to those categories that are on your timeline. Then the next step would be to label or identify those photos. Now when you're labeling your physical assets, you can always write something in pencil on the back of a photo. You want to use a light hand to do that. But eventually, when you digitize those photos, you want to make sure that you have the identifying information along with the photo, so that if you move that photo to a different computer or you back it up somewhere, that information, the caption, the identifying information on that picture will go with the digital photograph. And that's called the metadata. We actually put that information in the metadata. It's too long and involved to go into at this time, but that's something, again, we will be discussing in much greater detail in the future. There are also a couple of the videos that explain this quite well in the How to Save Your Life kit. If you look at your DVD or you go to the website and look at the videos there, they will have much more information on this. So that's all we're going to cover about that today. But I just wanted to go through those concepts really quickly for you. I think we'll be opening up for questions now. I am going to try to unmute all of your audio. If anybody has like a TV or something going on in the background, you might want to turn that off, because we can pick up everything that's going on in your room. So I'm gonna try unmuting all of you and just open it up and see if anybody has any questions.
We've got some comments here about not getting overwhelmed and to concentrate on a particular project, and we think that that's important. So focus on one piece at a time. Even with your life history assets, your stories, get a big picture, inventory, and then start to narrow it down to one piece at a time, and you'll find great power in doing that. Any of you that have had some experience doing that, how it's been helpful, or things we could learn from each other? Go.
Okay, Diana has a question. Do you write stories as you create the timeline? Great question, Diana. We talked about this quite a bit last week about brainstorming a timeline. And what we usually suggest is it's much easier if you use your timeline as sort of a receptacle for just capturing all the ideas that come to you as you're in the process of remembering things about your life that you might want to talk about in a story. And so, generally, what you want to do is keep the things that you write on your timeline to very just short phrases, just maybe 3 or 4 words that will remind you enough of what the situation was that you can go back and write about it later. But when you're initially doing your brainstorming, or when a random memory comes to you, even at a later time when you're in the middle of writing another story, you want to just jot that down very quickly on your timeline in just a short phrase that will be enough to remind you later on. And then after you look at your timeline as a whole, you can start to start circling some items that are really the most important ones that you think you might want to flesh out into a story later, rather than trying to write each story as you go along in chronicle order on your timeline. We're going to talk about what we call story triage next week in our webinar about that process of choosing what items on your timeline to write about. So thanks for that question. Okay, we've got Linda says, any suggestions for dealing with all of those slides? I have about 2,500. Tom,
yeah, I'll take that. There are several ways to do it, but one of the most important things for you to understand is what you've got. So in order to find out what you've got, if you have access to a slide projector, you can just make a review of those. If you have a little slide viewer, I have one that I simply put the slide in and hold up to the light. I can see what's on there. Depending on time, money, what you have, you could take the whole batch and have those converted and then look in a digital form. What I did was I narrowed it down from about 4,000 to 1,800, digitized those, and in the case, I have a slide scanner that I can do some of that myself, which it takes about 5 minutes a slide. That's a long time, and you have to be very patient and diligent. There are some good slide scanners, so you can do some of this yourself. There are some good services for doing that. I know some people have had some success sending them off through Costco. They now send their slides out, and there's a couple good services. I know there's one in Arizona, Dig My Pics. I've often recommended folks send their slides to Larson Digital up in North Ogden, which I find a very fine service. I think they're somewhere around maybe 30 cents a slide. I can't remember exactly, but there's some good folks. So you can have some people help you, but you need to understand what you've got, whether you do that after you get them in a digital environment or get them before, so you know which ones that you'll send off. And then I think it's a matter of taking and organizing those by category so that you put those in piles. I put mine in piles for Jeep trips, different family members, and just organized, so I had maybe 20 different categories that I organized his slides, and then I created an index book for them and saved them off on discs so that we could all share them. But the key is to understand what you've got and then get them into a digital environment so that they can be used in your stories.
We have a question from Tina, who says she's interested in learning more about the metadata. As I said before, we will be covering that in quite a bit more detail in a future webinar. She asked, when you scan a document, would you scan it as a JPEG or a PDF? And would you use metadata on a document's picture? Let me address that first issue. Again, that's going to be covered in great detail in a future as well, because there are a lot of elements about proper scanning that are really important when you're doing a printed book, especially because it's different than what you need for web use. We suggest that if you have a choice, if your scanner will allow you to do this, that you scan all of your originals as a TIFF file. It's .tif, because a TIFF file does not compress the information. It does make a larger file, but it will give you more information and higher quality information to use for a printed project. Then you can later make JPEG copies of your TIFF files to use to upload to a website, or any web use that you might need a smaller, more manageable file. But TIFF will definitely give you the highest quality for a printed document. We do not recommend scanning anything as a PDF. PDF is a great file format for other kinds of purposes, and a PDF is what you will ultimately want your book file to be saved in, that you are going to maybe send to a printer to print. But for scanning, you definitely want to scan photographs as TIFFs. If you have to scan them as a JPEG, or if you are taking them to a service that will only do JPEGs, you just want to make sure that you are setting your scanner to the highest possible quality setting, and the lowest amount of compression for a JPEG. So if you have a sliding scale that goes from 1 through 12, you want to choose 12. If you have an indication for quality that says, low, medium, high, you want maximum if you are scanning as a JPEG. Because otherwise you're going to end up with artifacts on your photographs, and those will be magnified. You might look great on a screen, but those flaws can be magnified when you are printing it. So you want to make sure that you start with a really high quality scan.
I've got a note here from Rachel. So
yeah, we'll talk. I sent Rachel an email about that. Oh, Rachel also said that some people, going back to the slide issue, if you're looking at slides and trying to figure out what's on them, that you can hold it up to your cell phone and use that as a backlight. That's a great suggestion. So.
And one of the things that we're working on is getting the forum up so that we can share these ideas with others as to where you find success and people that can help along the way to creating really wonderful completed projects that you can use in your lives. Any other comments or questions?
We've got a few more minutes here. If anybody has a question, you can just chime up if you have your mic on. Okay, here's Diana has a question. What format do you recommend when scanning documents and letters for publication? As I said before, even documents and letters, you can scan those as image files, as TIFFs as well. We basically scan everything that comes in as a TIFF. And even though I know a lot of people, will scan documents, types, letters, and that kind of thing as PDFs, it's better if they are image files, either a TIFF or a JPEG, so that you will have the maximum quality that you need, and it gives you more options as to what you can do with those in print. Okay, Epstein, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly, says, I use Photoshop Elements Organizer to tag pictures and scans with names, dates, locations. It's flexible to your needs, whatever they may be. That's a great suggestion, and you don't even have to have any special software. If you have Photoshop Elements, if you have Adobe Bridge, if you have Lightroom, if you have Picasa, any of those things will give you a way to type information in metadata. But if you don't have any of those software organizing or photo editing software programs, you can do the same thing just using Windows Explorer or Mac Finder. Well, they both have ways that you can enter in metadata, either captions or tags. Now, a tag is a little bit different than a caption or identifying information, in that you can actually put, it's kind of like using hashtags on the on Pinterest or whatever. You can search by those items. So you can put in a tag of, let's say that you have a photograph of maybe a photograph from a family reunion. It has a lot of people in it. Rather than putting, and then if you have separate folders set up for these different families, rather than putting one copy of the picture in everybody's folder, and duplicating the picture that way, which I have done on occasion, and it's not a bad thing to do. But if you don't want to do that, you can actually put tags in with the names of the people in the photograph, and then when you later on, you can search for you can search the name Mary, and it will bring up all of your pictures that might have Mary in that picture. So that can be useful. I tend to just loosely categorize things in folders so I know I can find them easily rather than obsessively tagging everything, because I think tagging, if you don't put a picture on your computer without putting tags in there, it can be really overwhelming, and you can spend a lot of time tagging. So I only use tags just sparingly as I need them, especially for a photograph that has a large group in it. Otherwise, if my photos are in their proper folders, I can find them pretty easily without having to tag everything. So that's kind of a personal preference as to whether you want to tag items or not. But that's a great suggestion. Thank you for that. Any other questions or comments?
I'll also say that we'll be repeating this webinar in not a replay, but we'll be doing it again this Thursday evening at 7 p.m. and invite you to attend that, and maybe don't want to just repeat this, but we'll be doing it if anyone you know may have missed it, and you're welcome to join us back if you have questions. It's always maybe come out a little bit different, but we'll be repeating this on Thursday evening at 7.
And also, if you have any friends or anybody that you know that might be interested in these topics, just shoot us an email, and we would be happy to send a code to that person to be able to join us on the webinar as well.